Margaret Behrens. I'm the current president of the Ramsey County League of Local Governments. And my home office is the Ramsey Conservation District, where I am serving my third term as a board supervisor. So tonight we're fortunate to have John Choi. We've waited for this presentation and we are so excited to finally have this happening. John is the Ramsey County Attorney. Since taking office in 2011, he's become a national leader in the fight against sex trafficking, both as a St. Paul City Attorney and in his current role as the Ramsey County Attorney. John's innovative approach to holding abusers accountable while working collaboratively with advocacy agencies to help victims has transformed the way government intervenes in domestic violence and sex trafficking situations. In addition, he has advanced reforms in other areas, including using GPS technology to keep victims safe, making it possible to reunite families of teens languishing in foster care systems, and combating fraud and elder abuse. And I want to welcome John Choi and the panel today. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Because I can never tell if the microphone's on. So I'm going to move around a little bit. And I think that this is a really great crowd. I think all of you, I know there's a lot of local elected officials. And I think that's really great because I think some of the things we talk about today really require people like you and the people that we all work for, which is the public, to get engaged around this issue. And across Ramsey County, not everybody is necessarily going to be thinking about or caring about. I know that they would care about this issue if they knew about some of the things that were happening. But until we get more and more people really thinking about these things, we're not going to be able to move the dial. But I'm so glad to see, really heartened by the fact that, today is a beautiful day. And all of you are here taking the time to be a part of this conversation. And I would like it to be a conversation. And so, and I also too, the task force that I'm going to talk about, it's really not necessarily my work. It was my vision to kind of put it into place and to empower the group. But it's really the work of a lot of dedicated people that were a part of this. And so instead of me talking to you for the full time that we have together, I thought it was really appropriate to bring along some of our task force members. And you'll have and I'm going to introduce them as we go into this presentation. But we're going to hear from them. And then towards the end, if we could have some form of a conversation about some of these issues, I think it would be really, really great. And before I begin, though, I should also, just to connect with all of you, I know that many of you are local elected officials. I really want, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your public service. The fact that you guys are here tonight really tells me that we're doing really great in Ramsey County. We've got committed citizens who are really, really caring. And so maybe we could go to that first slide. So this is an assembly line. Looks like it's a meat packing plant. I always show this because I want to just give you a little look into my world. Oftentimes, as the county attorney, I'm the chief prosecutor. I'm also the county attorney that's in charge of all of the child protection matters from a legal perspective, civil commitment. And one of the things that we, suffer from is just the tremendous volume of work that we have to do. And so oftentimes we will orientate these systems so that we can process all of these cases. But the reality is that all of those cases, they represent the lives of people and human beings, right? And so, and we're also very downstream. What I mean by that is we're at the very end of the line. And so we get involved when something really bad has happened, when we have to have a conversation with somebody about removing a child from the home, or when we're dealing with an incident that happens in a school and because it was so serious, a referral was made to the police, and then the police brought something to our attention, and then we have to handle something in the delinquency system. As the county attorney, I don't want to have to deal with those situations in the criminal justice or the juvenile justice system, if we can figure out ways that we can engage community thinking about some of these issues, I think that we can prevent these things from happening. And that's really what I want the community to really start thinking about, is how do we avoid those instances so that I, as a county attorney, and not that I don't want to do the work, but it's just we have a healthier community when I'm not involved. But a part of the leadership that I'm trying to provide around this issue is to utilize the position that I have and the perspective that I have in seeing all of these really sad and unfortunate situations, to get all of you to be thinking about what I'm seeing and then thinking about what we can do as a community around these issues. And so, as I talked about, what I'd like to do is I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of framing this issue about this whole issue about violence in schools. And then what I'd like to do is then turn it over to Erica Schumacher, who is my Director of Strategic Initiatives and Community Relations, to talk a little bit about some of the data that the task force looked at. And I want we're going to go through it really quickly, but there's some compelling things about race that I want all of us to really think about and think really hard about as we think and talk about this. And I know our panel members are going to want to talk about this issue as well. And it's not an easy thing to always talk about. And then I'm going to try to moderate kind of a discussion with our panel members. And then really I want to engage you as well. And so if any of you have a thought or a perspective that you want to add to this conversation, I really encourage you to just raise your hand, and we'll figure out a way to incorporate what you have to say or the question that you want to pose that others could address, or members of the panel or myself. So, our three panelists, and I'm going to ask our three panelists to introduce themselves. We have Connie Hays, and we have Larry Lucile, and Dr. Talia Tollfree. And Connie's going to go first, and she's going to show a video as a part of her presentation. So let me start off by talking a little bit about the genesis and the intent of what I was trying to accomplish with respect to this task force. One of the things that I was seeing as the county attorney is that we were getting in the 2015 school year and in 2016 a number of increased referrals of assault or fourth-degree assault. And what that charge is all about is when somebody assaults a school official or somebody working in the school, essentially that crime can't be anything else, right? And so it's a statute that's very clear in terms of like what happened, right? And one of the things that I was seeing as the county attorney in 2015 was that we were just having this increase in assaults that were happening in school, but the frightening thing about it was that we were talking about students who were assaulting teachers, right? And so that situation caught my attention, and it certainly caught the attention of the public, because when you think about that, just on its surface, at a very, very superficial level, it represents something that is not good for our society, a deterioration of respect for authority. If the institution of education in schools, if you think about it, it's the greatest liberating thing for anybody who's in poverty, right? I mean, for me, my education is a reason why I'm here today, and for a lot of Americans. And so that just isn't a good thing. And so we were hearing more and more about these instances. And so if we go to the next slide, what we were seeing in 2015 was just that kind of a dramatic jump. We had in the previous year, 2014, we had 14 instances that were referred. And in 2015, we had 28 instances that were involving that type of situation. Now, the good news is that it's getting better. In 2016, we had less. So that is a kind of an improvement. But this issue came to light in, I think it was in October, November of 2015. But if we can just go back to that slide, Erica, real quick. And if you think that these instances that are happening are in the St. Paul schools in Ramsey County. That's not true. I mean, actually, it's kind of spread out throughout the county. I think Erica will talk a little bit. She'll show a slide about kind of where these instances were occurring throughout the county. So it's not just happening in St. Paul schools, but I think that sometimes that people have that misperception. So if we can go to the next slide. I think I talked a little bit about this, but this, you know, this is why I think on a very, very superficial level, okay, when we just hear about the issue, it is very concerning because it's a declining respect for authority. And then we also are hearing about this narrative about this school to prison pipeline. And I think if we have a community that is believing that's what's happening, or if that truly is happening, I mean, regardless of where you might be on that particular issue, that can't be a good thing. And so that in and of itself is very confusing. And so I think we really need to start thinking about all of these various issues and listen to one another, because one of the things that I've also noticed as the county attorney involved in law enforcement and prosecution, there are such wide perspectives about where this is, where we're all headed as a society and what we need to do to fix it. And I think we're not doing enough of kind of bringing people together to talk about the things that we really need to fix. And instead, I think what we're doing as a society is really looking at things from our own perspective, how we were raised, and filtering everything through that perspective. And that's causing, I think, this big polarization that we have on a whole host of issues. And I don't want it to happen as it relates to how we look at school violence and what we can do to fix it. And so, as a part of a particular case that happened at Central High School, I was kind of outspoken about what had happened at that school with respect to one particular case, but I used it as an opportunity to really talk about what I just told all of you, and said we really need to bring our community together and have a task force. And the goal of the task force would not be that we wanted to micromanage our school boards. And another part of all of this is that to lay out the foundation that, because I think it's really easy for us to say, well, if it's happening in a school, it's isolated to a building, or it's the school board's issue, and wherever that's happening, they have to figure that out. But really, if you think about this issue about escalating levels of violence in schools and students assaulting teachers, it's not a school issue, it's actually a community one. It's just manifesting in our schools. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of how that is and why that is. And so that was kind of the impetus of trying to pull this all together and getting everybody together and going beyond. I mean, the simple superficial solution that all of us can just say is that, well, if parents would just raise our kids to respect authority, we wouldn't have these problems, right? But it isn't that simple, because the world that I live in, the juveniles that I have to deal with in the delinquency system, the children that are coming through in our child protection systems, we are talking about kids who have had immense levels of trauma from a very, very early age. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was done by Kaiser in California, and it's been replicated by many others. But the more stressful, adverse experiences that you have throughout your life, it results in a lot of things manifesting later, one of which could be just acting out, not having, being able to control and resolve conflict. But that's really kind of what we're seeing. And so I think, as many of you are probably familiar with that study, but those are the issues that we really need to start thinking about. And it's, coming from a middle class background, having two parents that love me and raised me well, that wasn't an issue for me, but I need to start thinking about and educating myself to learn a little bit about some of the kids that are coming through our child protection systems, our juvenile delinquency systems, and also who are in our schools. And we have to figure out a way to address those issues. Because if we don't, what will happen is we'll address these by kind of minimizing and in polarizing ways, and we'll never really get to the root of all of this. So maybe if we can go to the next slide. So maybe if we, I think I talked a little bit about some of this stuff here. Let's go to the next slide. I wanted to get to, oh, there we go. Okay, so the group that was assembled, we chose 39 diverse people from throughout the county, teachers, parents, anybody that would have a perspective of working with youth, school resource officers. We wanted to have that conversation as well, and we wanted to make sure that it was representative of the entire county, not just a particular area of the county, but the entire county. And then also our two co-chairs were Suzanne Kelly and Jeremiah Ellis. Suzanne, at the time, was working for the St. Paul Foundation, and now she is with the Minneapolis Public Schools. And Jeremiah Ellis was a foundation representative from Generation Next. But one of the things that I wanted to have the two of them co-chairs, because again, this is a community issue. We need to have community solutions, and we really need to be looking at our foundations to be thinking about this issue as well. And we also hired an independent facilitator, Christine Wobleski from TeamWorks, who really did a great job of helping facilitate this group. But I got to say that this group of 39 committed people, they met 10 times over the course of about 7 months. And the conversations were very, very robust. I made a very conscious decision. I said to myself, I'm going to go to the first meeting, but I didn't want this community group to be influenced in any way by me. I just made a commitment to myself that I would champion what it was that this group would come up with, because I truly wanted it to be a community perspective, not an elected official perspective. All we asked that is that whatever recommendations and thoughts that they had would be grounded, and they spent a lot of time looking at the data and thinking through a number of things, but we asked that whatever they came up with would be realistic. And so we had 10 of these meetings throughout the course of 7 months, and then they came up with the process of, they were kind of learning together, having conversations, and then coming up with some recommendations. And so with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Erica Schumacher, who is going to talk a little bit about the data that the task force looked at, and then talk a little bit about the recommendations, but we don't want to go too much into detail about that because we want to have time for the conversation.
Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Like John said, we're just going to walk quickly through the data. There was lots of data gathered as part of this process. So there was a great interest on the part of the task force members to reach out and figure out what data could we gather beyond what's easily available. And so they spent one evening brainstorming a huge list of ideally what data they would like to see. And then our facilitator went back and we ended up actually hiring a data analyst who was very familiar with educational data. And so there's a lot of data on our website, but tonight, in the interest of getting to the panel quickly, we're not going to walk you through all of that, but just so you know, all the data that John referenced, the community meeting that we had, the online survey that we did, all of that is available on our website, so feel free to go ahead and check that out on your own. So the one thing from the last slide that is really stark across all of our data, whether we're looking at discipline data or achievement data, is that we have significant racial disparities in Ramsey County. And I'm sure that's not new to anybody in this room, but that was really something that was prevalent in our conversations and that was really important to our task force members. I'm sure our panelists will talk about it, but that we really need to be thinking about differentiated solutions because we do have significant disparities in our county. And so this is the one slide we had our data analysts pull together data from all across Ramsey County. And you can see there are significant disparities in terms of suspension rate. So it's a little bit hard to see those lines, the different colors, but that top line is African American students. So you can see, and this is adding together all of our districts across Ramsey County, all of our students across Ramsey County. You can see that we have significant disparities in terms of who's getting suspended. And so the rest of this data is really data from our office, and I just want to remind people what we're seeing in schools is kind of the bottom of the pyramid, right? So there's a lot that happens in schools that doesn't get reported, period, right? So that's the base of the most activity. Then we look at what happens in schools that does get reported to police, and that's kind of moving up. That's the next smaller group. And then only the conduct that's really investigated and substantiated that gets presented to our office is kind of what we're seeing. So we're just kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we can understand about this. So this is some data that we had pulled together. John was really interested in, this was predated the task force, but John was really interested in looking at what do we know about what's going on with kids in schools and what can we learn. And this is a little bit hard for you to see, but this is by district. So John referenced earlier that about half of the offenses, and this is all offenses, so this isn't just the offenses that John was speaking of earlier, the assault fours. This is just everything that shows up in our office related to youth in Ramsey County. And you can see that about half of them are in St. Paul and about half of them are in Greater Ramsey County. As we look at offenses in schools by charge, so like what things are coming to our office, the most that disorderly conduct is kind of a catch-all, so there's a lot that falls into that. So that's most of the charges that are coming into our office, and then the assault fives, that would be like fighting in schools. So that characterizes the most of the offenses are related to one of those two categories. If you look at offenses at school by theme, so we actually had staff, and this is, again, one of the challenges, not only in our office, but across our systems, is our data systems. So our data systems are pretty obsolete, and we're working on improving them, but we actually have to have staff manually pull and categorize some of this stuff. And so they did their best to look at, and again, there are limitations on all data, right? The limitations on this data is that, so for instance, one of the categories says unprovoked attack. So does that mean it was truly unprovoked? What that means is, based on what they can read in the report, they didn't see that there was an immediate impetus or immediate provocation for the response. But could that have been an outcome of something that happened earlier that day, something that was ongoing? That, again, this is just based on what we know. So you can see that that category, unprovoked attack, has a lot of activity in it, as well as a student response to staff direction. So staff is giving a direction to a student and they respond in that manner. And then I would say those are the bulk of the offenses that we get in our office are by those two themes. Again, if you look at offenses at schools by race, we see that there's significant disproportionality. This does not include our disorderly conducts because there were way too many of those to go through. So this is all other offenses except disorderly conducts. But again, you can see that African American students are significantly disproportionately involved in offenses that come into our office. Offenses at schools by age. So this varies a little bit, but you can see I think in the last year we looked at, which was 2015, it's kind of spread out a little bit, but otherwise kind of clustered around maybe some of those transition years, 14, 15, and then tends to go back down as kids are maturing, getting older, right? And then offenses at schools by gender. So again, more males than females, as we're looking at all offenses that are coming in. They tend to be more males involved than females, 2/3 to 3/4 are male. So now we're just looking at assault fours. So if we reference back to that first slide that John showed where the trajectory was going up, kind of the impetus of it, this is the data that we're talking about here. So if we're just breaking down assault fours by age, you can see that some of the younger kids are more involved in some of the more serious incidents. By race, again, disproportionately African American students involved. By gender, this one is a little bit closer. So if you remember, the gender slide on all of our data was about 2/3 to 3/4 male. This is really a little bit, it's still more males, but it's a little bit closer, yeah.
Okay, just kind of the context, I assume assault 4 is more egregious than assault 3, or just briefly, what do we constitute?
Assault 4 can only mean an assault on a school official or somebody working in a school.
So there are two different statutes. One is, it's an assault on a school official in their official capacity. So one is related to school officials, so principals, teachers, support staff. There's another that's specifically related to police. So there are two different, so that's when we're talking about assault 4s, it's the more serious offenses.
Just a question. A few of these slides on the different data, it seems like there's, I don't know what's going on, but in 15, it seems like there's a shift. And I've noticed that on a few different categories here. I'm just wondering, like, is it because there was, you know, some greater discussion going on, or what happened between 14 and 15? Because I see it here, and I also saw it in a few of the other slides. That's like 15. It looks like it's almost like the data is like, well, the trends are a little bit different. So I don't know if you kind of saw that and noted anything by it, or?
Yeah, I guess I can't explain the jumps, but I can say that because the assault 4 numbers are relatively low, the jumps could represent, I mean, there could be one incident that involved one group of kids, right, that maybe the next year, like for instance, as I go through the data, there was one where Asian students was really high, and that happened to be, there was a fight that involved a ton of Asian students, like 20 or something, right? So there may be some things like that.
Male and female is shrunk.
Yes.
And I think it was in 15 also, the disparity between African American and Caucasian has shrunk. And so I was just wondering, like, and maybe there was just one big case in 15 that kind of skewed it.
Yeah. I mean, I can't directly answer that. I don't know if you have other thoughts, John, but some of that happens with the data. You know, it's hard to, we were like, whoa, why was Asian so high and what's going on? And they said, well, there was this really big incident that happened. And so, yeah. So then just getting to the key recommendations, and again, I'm going to be really brief because we're hoping to spend most of the time on the panel. All of this is online as well, but there were 5 key areas that throughout this 10 meeting process, members distilled down to 5 different categories that they really felt like were important. The first is building healthy relationships with youth. I think that came across loud and clear, both with youth who've had exposure to trauma. We know that connections with caring adults are incredibly important and can actually help them overcome that. But also just in general that youth respond differently in the context of a relationship than they do without that. And so it's really critical across all dimensions to do everything we can to build healthy relationships with youth. The second is enhancing our positive, proactive approaches, that we can't afford to just sit back and react when things happen, but we should really be thinking strategically and collaboratively about what are we doing to get ahead of this, what are we doing to be more proactive. There are lots of different approaches to that, but I think that was definitely a resounding theme from the task force. The third being sharing and improving data. This was a challenge both within systems as we tried to analyze data, that data is collected inconsistently, that it can't even be shared because there are silos within the county, for instance, that the county departments can't share data, and then also among systems, so that different school districts can't share data. They don't necessarily know what a child's experience has been or how to prepare for that child coming into their district from another district. So there was a lot of talk about what can we do to help improve our data systems across the county. Increasing parent and guardian support was also highlighted as really important. Over and over again we heard parents just don't have enough support with their children. This came through both with a lot of single parents raising children, but also just in general, particularly with parents of teenagers, and I can attest to this. There's a lot of support around early childhood and ECFE and classes like this. There's less support as your kids start to go through puberty and are all of a sudden dealing with hormones and experimenting and doing all this stuff, and parents are going, whoa, what do I do? And so really needing more support to help parents, both peer support between parents, and then also what can we be doing as a community to better support parents with their students. And then lastly, improving the training, development, and learning of adults. So we had people across systems involved in the task force. We had teachers, we had people who worked in schools, people who were law enforcement officers, and all of them across the board said they felt like their colleagues would appreciate some more training and development about how to better engage with youth, as well as I think some parents on the task force feeling like they would appreciate that. They felt like parents or adults were struggling with how to best manage classrooms, how to best engage with kids on playgrounds. So really being intentional about the training and development that we're offering for our adults. So with that, was there a question? Yeah.
Was there anything in the recommendations that was specific to mental health support within
Yes.
systems?
systems?
Yes. In fact, I think the comment was made, and Connie, you'll probably address this a little bit, but it's not that we need to improve the mental health system for children, but we actually have to create a mental health system for children. And the increasing mental health needs of students, some chemical dependency issues, particularly with some of our older students, that was definitely a focus of conversation, and definitely some desire for that to be part of the solution.
So,
All right.
for me, one of the greatest takeaways, I guess if you think about all of this, these issues that are playing out in our schools, right? And we see the disparity data that's present. If we continue down this path and we don't do anything to change that, what's going to end up happening is this population will end up in my world, and those disparities will even be larger, right? And so that's a part where I really think that as a community, this affects all of us, and that we really need to think about how we design better, effective interventions. And I think another big takeaway, this is not just about schools. I mean, if you really think about some of the recommendations that are in the report, it's about some of the things that we do in my office, like how we process and think about juvenile justice cases. I mean, if you think about it, in the report, you'll see a lot of discussion about really thinking about restorative practices as opposed to punitive practices. And so we have this kind of thought that is it's embedded as a paradigm in our society that if somebody does something wrong, there needs to be an action to respond to that is punishment or punitive in nature. And we also have victims and public safety to think about, obviously, right? But there are situations that don't implicate public safety, and there are situations where the victim isn't really believing that they would rather have a situation where if you could just figure out a way for that young person to recognize what they did was wrong, that they won't do it again, and you do whatever you need to do to get them on the right track in life, and as long as you don't spend any more money doing it, and by the way, we spend just tons of money in our juvenile justice system, but I think the public would say, if you can figure that out, you should do that. And if you can figure out a way to have more of a focus on rehabilitation, those are things that you ought to be thinking about. And so a lot of the things that I was hearing from the task force members apply to so many systems, not just the school system, but also mine, the juvenile justice system, and how we think about how we process, again, remember on that assembly, right? Just because the way that we've done it doesn't mean that we have to continue doing that. So if there's a way to think about maintaining public safety and ensuring that we're doing right by victims, but more importantly, if we can figure out the rehabilitation standpoint, those are things that, as I read the report and listened to the task force members, those are the thoughts and feelings that I had, and I really believe that that's something as a county attorney that I really need to be thinking about over the course of the long-term future. So with that, I'd like to start by having this conversation with our esteemed panelists who served on the task force. And we have I think the first thing that I'm going to ask them to do is introduce themselves, and then maybe answer the question of why they decided to serve on this task force, because it was a tremendous amount of work. I mean, we're talking about 10 meetings over the course of 6 months. These meetings lasted usually about 3 hours in the evening, and there were times where the task force members, at the conclusion of a meeting, wanted to continue to keep sitting around and talking about these issues because they were so important to what they were thinking about in terms of what we need to do as a community. And so what we'll do is we'll start first with Connie Hays. And I know, Connie, you have a video. I don't know.
Most of us are familiar with schools and school districts, but have you ever heard of an intermediate school district? It's sort of like a co-op, where lots of people pool resources and ideas for a common goal. Intermediate school districts provide specialty services to regular school districts within a geographical region. We serve more than 20,000 students annually in the areas of special education, area learning centers, care and treatment, career technical programs, and more. These are specialized services that many smaller school districts find difficult or too costly to provide on their own. Intermediate school districts serve some of Minnesota's most unique learners. Many students are referred to us by the school district they live in. Our youngest learners are small children, and our oldest students are young adults in transition to live on their own and succeed in a career. In our special education programs, we serve all kinds of unique learners, some with autism, fetal alcohol syndrome, or cognitive or emotional disorders. But all our students have one thing in common: they are determined to succeed. Unique learners have unique learning needs. They need teachers and staff who are experts in disabilities, special education, mental health and trauma, and they need unique facilities and equipment too. For example, meet DJ. He's in 5th grade and has been to 5 different elementary schools. He's been suspended 8 times and expelled from school twice for violent behavior. As a toddler, DJ experienced severe trauma when he was hurt by his babysitter. He doesn't have an official medical diagnosis, but is suspected to have a behavior disorder. DJ's teachers and parents thought he would do best in an intermediate school district, so that is where he is now. Our biggest challenge is how to best support a subset of our students who have complex disabilities and extraordinary mental health needs. Some of these students, like DJ, are exposed to trauma, like community violence, natural disasters, domestic abuse, neglect, and more. This combination of needs often results in dangerous situations and violent behavior at school. Our schools have become the front line of the children's mental health system. Keeping everyone safe is our biggest responsibility, but we also need to meet all educational expectations. We're pretty good at it, but it gets harder every day because the need for our services continues to grow, both in the number of students we serve and in the level of support they require. Critical incidents, assaults on staff, threats to schools, police interventions, and suicide attempts are not uncommon. But student behavior can be misunderstood, and educators know behavior is one way students with disabilities communicate. One time, DJ became so violent, we had to call the police to calm him down. They took him to the emergency room, but the hospital told his family that he was too violent to be near other doctors and patients, so they sent him back to school. Schools alone don't have resources to address the growing group of students who show dangerous behaviors, complex pharmacological profiles, and/or multiple developmental, cognitive, and neurobiological disorders. Our schools are at a tipping point. DJ doesn't have access to regular mental health care. His parents love him and are trying their best, but they have exhausted all educational resources within their reach. DJ's family is at a tipping point. If we don't help DJ now, he could have lifelong challenges with his mental illness that affect the entire community. What if there was an integrated education and mental health partnership that could offer solutions to families like DJ's? Imagine if school became DJ's go-to place for both mental health treatment and education. During the school day, he could experience hands-on learning, therapy, counseling, and more. His teachers and medical providers would work together throughout the school day to meet DJ's mental health and learning needs so he can gain the skills he needs to succeed in school and life. This future is not in DJ's dreams. It's not in a private school. It's not in Canada or Finland. It's right here in Minnesota. To jumpstart this future, the Integrated Education and Mental Health Partnership needs one more partner. That partner is you.
Thank you, Erica, for playing the video. We put this video together to work with our policymakers this year at the legislature to help them understand the needs of the students that our 14-member districts are referring to our special education programs. I'm finishing up my 11th year at 916, and every year that goes by, we see more and more students referred to our programs who have very complex challenges like DJ you saw in the video here. And I know John wanted us to share why we were interested in being on the task force. And I remember when the incident happened at St. Paul Public Schools in the Central High, and that was in the newspaper. And I think I even might have mentioned this to my school board, that I think this was going to be the beginning of an opportunity for us to get more attention about the need for mental health services in our schools. And we had been at the legislature for years advocating, and was an opportunity for us to be a part of the bigger conversation. So when I was invited to be a part of the task force, it was just a great opportunity for me to advance to a greater degree some of the challenges that we have and strategies that we've been employing at 916. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
So Larry, Lucile?
Good evening. My name is Larry Lucile. I'm a retired educator, 40 years. I spent 15 years as a guidance counselor in St. Paul Public Schools, 25 years as a building principal, 5 in middle school and 20 in high school. And I had the honor of being the principal of the Hennepin County Detention Center School. It's located in the Juvenile Detention Center in Hennepin County. My reason for participating was I felt a real need to have a practitioner perspective on the committee. So oftentimes school districts bring experts in to solve the problems, and in most cases they've never worked in a school or worked with kids. So I thought it was particularly important to be able to give at least some insight into some of the problems and causes.
And next we have Dr. Talea Tolofree.
Good evening. I am a parent of St. Paul Public Schools. I have 3 children that went through St. Paul Public Schools. I attended St. Paul Public Schools. I also now am an independent contractor for implementing restorative practices in St. Paul schools. And so when I was invited to be a part of the committee, I wanted to bring the restorative practices perspective, especially after seeing the number of incidents that were happening in St. Paul Public Schools, and then having the opportunity to engage with community from a number of different backgrounds and professions. I thought that would be a great opportunity to bring restorative practices so that we can start talking about a new and different approach instead of the punitive approach that's been taking place for so many years.
So let's talk, part of the task force discussion, a lot of discussion was had about who these kids are, and I think there was a lot of discussion about a better understanding kind of why these kids are acting out or aren't being able to control behavior or aren't respecting authority. We had lots of discussion about that, so maybe we can start with that question, and I'll start with you, Connie.
Sure. Well, John, you mentioned earlier the ACEs study, and we actually took one of our programs a couple of years ago and gave the ACEs survey to a group of students. And if you're familiar with the study, you know it's a scale of 1 to 10. And the students in this program scored at 7, 8, and 10, all of them. So that tells you the level of trauma that the young people that are enrolled in our programs experience. And you have to understand that in our programs, we're seeing the most challenged youth in the area from our 14 member districts. So besides trauma and it expressing itself in for youth in ways that they're trying to cope with that trauma, beyond that, you mentioned mental health, and the increase in challenges with mental health in our youth in our schools is growing so rapidly, and it's something that we have not, as a state, put enough resources behind. But we're starting to as a state, and as policymakers, as leaders, this is really up to us to continue to push policymakers to continue to support mental health services and to build that system of care for our youth in Minnesota. So experiences with trauma, untreated mental health issues, as well as students that have disabilities. And so the students we see have very, very complex pictures, often including all 3 of those issues with a very complex pharmacology profile as well. And it's very challenging to figure out what is the key, what is the underlying answer to support these students, and it takes a lot of resources and a lot of patience and a lot of trying of different strategies in cooperation with the families. One of the things that we often do as adults is we want to blame the parents for what we see in a student that's acting out, or we blame the students, or we blame the teachers. And all of those blaming situations don't result in helping us resolve the situation. So that's something that we're all challenged to try to reduce that blaming and to look for ways to resolve that.
Thank you, Connie. Larry, you want to?
Well, I went into education with the belief and understanding that the educational system is innately racist and classist. So as a beginning educator, my whole idea was to work with young people with that concept in mind. Quite frankly, I think sometimes the tendency is to label all kids that have trouble in school as having a need around the mental health. And in reality, it's more relational. And in my, again, I speak from my own experience, not from anybody else's, but oftentimes a student's acting out behavior was a response to an adult or an individual reacting to them in a negative way. And then they, in turn, responded in a negative way. And then it just created the concern in the school. So for me, the majority of kids that I've had good fortune to work with, there have been students in need of mental health, but mostly just needing someone to explain how things work, how the system works, where to go for support, how to get support, and then to include as many people within that school to show support for that young individual.
I think that there definitely are some trauma issues and mental health issues, but there also are some race issues that I think that we have to deal with. It was very clear in our process during the task force meetings. It's clear in our data. And I think that as adults, we really have to start seeing our kids as our future and not as our failures. Because when we interact with our students as though they're failures or though everything is their fault, even how the language that we use, our kids are acting out, well, we have to remember that our kids are in relationship with adults all the time. So adults have to begin to take more responsibility about how our kids are and how our kids show up at school and how we interact with them when they're there. I know that teachers have limited ways that they can control what's going on outside of school, but once the kids are in our building, we have to be able to figure out how we can interact with them differently, how we can build strength-based relationships with them and their parents, and not contacting parents when something goes wrong, but what are we doing to be preventative? And so it's not the child's fault, it's not the teacher's fault, it's not the parent's fault, it's all of us as a community. We have to begin to start looking at things as a community and not the them and the they and we and those. I mean, we have to start looking at it as a community in order for us to come up with solutions. And just like Larry said, I've been in a number of incidents where children were actually being de-escalated pretty good by some teachers in the building, but then you have other folks in the building that may come by and disrupt what's going on, like, oh, you're misbehaving again, different things like that. So we need a lot more training for our staff in our buildings and a lot of more support for them as they deliver services to our children. So I just want us to keep in mind that it's not just what our kids do, but it's what we do as adults. And our kids desire to be treated as human beings. I think that sometimes some kids come with so much that sometimes we forget that they're human beings and that they're living a very complex life, and we think about ourselves, some of the things that we've been through as children, or some of the things our family members have been through. we needed support at different times, and we need to think about what kind of support our children need when they show up in different situations.
Lee, I think that's a great segue kind of in the next area that I wanted to explore a little bit, which is, and you said something that I think was something that resonated with many members of the task force, but you talked a little bit about the relationship that adults, and so it could be a teacher, it could be a police officer, it just could be anybody that's working with youth, right? And about the orientation that we might have in that relationship. And what is required of adults is that we have to meet the kids where they're at. And I know that from a social and societal perspective, adults are in control of the building and you follow the rules. One thing that really came out loud and clear, from this discussion that we had at Task Force is that as a community, we have to really be thinking a little bit differently about when we're dealing with kids who are coming to school. And if they're like, as Dave Wilmus describes, many of the kids that he deals with, as survival-based kids who are moving from one place to another, or there are things that are happening in their world. When they go home, there's domestic violence happening or whatever it is. But a big part of what we're trying to talk about is adults kind of meeting the kids where they're at, which requires us to be flexible or to change. And that's a little bit different from how many of us may perceive our respect for authority and things of that sort. So let's talk a little bit about how, as the conversation went along in the task force, we talked about how adults in these kids' lives who have positions of authority could be acting in unhelpful ways, perhaps, or in very positive ways that were successful.
Well, yeah, particularly in schools. 'Cause again, the young people were talking about it as it was depicted in the video, and what we know is that they have multiple opportunities to go to multiple schools. And unfortunately, our schools tend to shy away from embracing when they come to school. It very often happens where a young person, for example, coming out of the juvenile detention center will report to a school, and obviously it's not their home school, but they're greeted with such negative vibes. We don't have a program for you. Come back in 2 days. They'll let them sit in the office for an hour until the counselor has time to go fetch them and prepare a program for them. Everything is negative, and this isn't. This happens quite often. And working in the juvenile detention center for the last 6 years that I did, I tried to interview just every kid that came through the door, and one of the biggest things that they talked about, and most often, was the disrespect they received from school. Coming to the school, they don't want us there. They don't want me there. How their parent was treated was another big one. They talked down to my mom. They didn't respect my mom. So just common sense, as I would tell my colleagues, how would you want your wife treated or your husband treated if they walk into school? How would you want your son or daughter treated coming into a new school? Common sense types of things like that. And that doesn't cost money. That just takes a little bit of common sense and a little bit of focus.
It's common sense, so it's simple, but it's hard. And when we prepare our teachers and when we prepare educators to be in our schools, in our classroom, we don't really prepare them with some of these kinds of conversations. We expect they come to school with those skills in mind. And what we find and what Larry is saying is so often our educators don't have those skills. In our district, and I know in a lot of my member school districts, we're all moving on this equity journey of starting to look at our own biases that we carry with us and how that causes us to respond to young people in ways that might not be very healthy. But that's a long journey, and it does take money from my perspective as a superintendent, because we have to engage our staff in opportunities to learn and to have some discussion and to do reflection and to come back to that over and over again, so that the skill that Larry's saying we want people to have, that they get some practice at it and they're able to use it effectively when they're interacting with young people. Everybody that I work with has the desire to do that. It's just getting from A to B, and to be able to do that consistently over time, that I still call it a journey. I'm on my own personal equity journey and trying to assist our leaders in our district as well as our staff through that journey. And it's very complex and it's very hard, but it's also very exciting, and it's very rewarding. But you know, we've come a long way, but I can see our journey is still a long ways out in front of us as well.
The problem with that perspective is the kids are falling through the cracks in the meantime. The problem oftentimes in education is everybody's being trained. They still have expectations of kids. Everybody's being trained. And as I used to tell my colleagues in the classroom and in the building in general, Johnny only has one 9th grade year, and he doesn't have the opportunity to come back next year and try it over again. That's where, again, I think you have to be constructively critical as a building administrator of building administrators if you don't want to be concerned about people criticizing you. So I think you have to be reflective, as you said. But there's accountability as adults, as people that get a paycheck every 2 weeks. They're expected to do their job professionally. So again, as a building administrator, I felt it was my responsibility to convey expectations of how students should be treated, and then hold those individuals accountable. You don't have to treat them harshly. You don't have to be disrespectful. But just as they and we hold young people to expectations, so should our employees and the people we work with, and we ought to be able to talk to each other and hold each other accountable. Yeah, I think it's great that we're able to get training for our people, and I think the equity thing, I'm not necessarily sold on how school districts have done it to this point. But again, in the meantime, while everybody's trying to figure out themselves as adults in their profession, our young people are falling through the cracks, and I think it's unfair.
And we've got to move away from compliance-based education. I think that when we start talking about how we interact with students and what our education system has been traditionally, it is very, when we're dealing with behaviors and we're dealing with conflict, it is very punitive, and consequences are punitive. And even when you talk to students and you talk to their parents and you talk to their parents about what their experience was in school. And so when we talk about, well, the parent doesn't show up, we don't have parent engagement, have you talked to the parent to see what their experience was in school? And it's not something that's just happening with this generation, but it's generations before, and the continued, I guess, interactions with a lot of our students have been negative, and it has been with their parents. And I think that there are teachers who want to make that change and want to make that shift, and we need to be able to support them with training. We need to be able to support them with dollars. We need to be able to support them with opportunities to engage students and families on a different level, because what we're doing is not working. And I know that there are teachers out there that want to see that change. They want to make that shift. There's a number of different barriers that may play into them making that change, but I do know that there are teachers out there that want different strategies and want to make those relationships. They want to make those connections, and they understand that those relationships and building those connections with families and community members are important to the success of our children and to the success of them being educators.
One other point is that all the answers don't necessarily have to come from the people within those four walls. There are people that work with our students and our families out in the community that do a great job, that would supplement much of what schools are trying to do with families and kids. Again, sometimes you have to think a little differently and embrace those community agencies as part of the solution, rather than some schools look at them as part of the problem.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of discussion about that, bringing in community agencies. Also, there's lots of discussion about faith-based organizations and churches and the role that they can play as well in a lot of these issues.
And there was a give and take about bringing faith-based people, and the thought was, well, it has to relate to religion. It doesn't. Just having someone from their church sit in on a conversation or a conference, or seek them for suggestions or thoughts, it doesn't necessarily have to violate that school church thing. Yeah, but again, so often, and more often than not, there are many answers out in the community if you just look and invite people, embrace people to come in.
And taking into consideration that in some communities, especially in the African American community, faith is extremely important, and it is largely a part of a lot of family support system, to have their pastors counsel, to have their pastors show up. I'm sure you all have seen them show up in court. So it really is a point of disengagement when that can't happen, when you're talking about solving problems at school and you're talking about bringing in community members for support. When we talk about our values and how we show up and how we bring our values, when you start detracting from what people's support system is and you talk about faith, that is one way too where that kind of relationship gets broken, because now you're telling a single parent possibly that they can't have support from their faith-based communities, which are largely part of how we solve problems in the African American community. And when you sort of violate that, or you kind of dismiss that, that also can create some tension too.
So we've had a lot of discussion. There's also a lot of elected officials in the room here, so can I just pose a question to all of you? What do you guys think so far? We've got some school board members, we've got council members. Yeah.
Well, just a comment. I mean, I'm clergy too, and I think, okay, a lot of times, you know, there's so many different circumstances. People come from all walks of life. They oftentimes just want to be heard. Mm-hmm. And if you're a good active listener, you know, just listening to somebody helps a lot. And as clergy, I listen to anybody. I don't care what religion you are. If you have faith, if you don't have faith, I'm here to listen. But it seems like, you know, it's so important to be proactive opposed to being reactive. And I think that's just one of the goals. A lot of people that ask, you know, talk to me, they just want to avoid getting into trouble. Mm-hmm. So.
Anybody else? We got someone right there.
So I think one of the key themes I'm taking away from this is a mutual respect, right? A mutual respect among students, among teachers to students, parents to teachers, the whole array. When you bring in the faith-based aspects of this, there is a respect there. You know, these kids have been brought up in this faith environment, and there's a respect with the older gentleman sitting 3 seats over and the clergy people that's not translating into the school environment. And you know, that's the biggest challenge for me. I'm a former high school coach. I've seen all the challenges as well, and it's hard. It's hard, but how do we help these students to get that, help them in that respect area? You know, that they come into school respecting that instructor just as they do that pastor. And I know it's earned, it goes both ways. But I think that's one of the major challenges, is there's a lack of respect across the board. I want to say discipline so badly, but discipline's got a negative connotation to it these days. You know, I went to a Catholic school. I went to St. Bernard's, 12 years. It was a completely different educational system. I really wasn't given an opinion until I left. It was different, you know, but it worked for me. And you know, that seems outdated, but I can tell you the discipline I had in those 12 years in that school have made me the person I am today. My home environment wasn't perfect either. I had plenty of challenges. My mother died when I was 7. My father was an alcoholic. I made it. You know, so how do we help these kids? How do we help this mutual respect?
I think one of the things is we have to change our language. We can't talk about how do we help these, you know, how do we help the kids? How do we help all of us, right? So, and then when we talk about our pastors and the relationships that our kids have with the respect that our kids have with our pastors or their clergy, is there's a relationship there. And that is what is missing from our school system with a lot of our kids who we see these behaviors happening. So if you are, from the perspective of our children who are in these situations, you're going into a school, hardly any of the teachers look like you. Any of the adults or the leadership look like you. You hardly can find yourself in the curriculum. So there's a number of factors that play into why children feel like they don't have respect, right? So we talk about how do students give respect to adults when they feel disrespected even before they get into the system. So the education system has not really been set up for our children to succeed in the first place, and they know and understand that. And when you have students that can talk to you about how they've held their hand up and they've been looked over and they feel invisible, so when we talk about respect, it comes out in a number of different ways. And I don't know that all teachers realize that what they're doing may be disrespectful. I had a situation the other day where a teacher, it was a little Latino boy, and she continues to call him Luis, and his name is Luis. He wants her to call him Luis, but she constantly calls him Luis, and then she goes, I don't know why he behaves that way when he's in my classroom. As soon as I talk to him, he shuts down and he gets angry. Well, he's asked you several times to call him Luis, but you continue to call him Louis. So little things like those, like little microaggression, things like that, sometimes set off students, and then the response is what others will see as disrespect, but never taken into account of the disrespect that was given out, whether it was intentional or unintentional. And I'm sure she didn't mean it, but after being talked about it, you would hope that would change. So it can be things where people think it's just, that's a small incident versus the larger incidents that John is dealing with, but all of them can spark that feeling of kids wanting to act out in disrespect.
I think that the vision that you're articulating is what we want, is that we want all kids to be respectful of their parents, their authority, etc., right? And my background, you shared a little bit about your background. My background was probably just like yours. I'm Catholic school educated, and I went to school, and I didn't get an opinion, right? It worked for me. But what I'm also recognizing too, in having just the experience of having dealt with just kids that are coming through the juvenile system and in our child protection systems, the response or the methods that worked for me, it worked, but it's not necessarily going to work for these kids. And I think that's the real hard part, you know, because I think that what that requires us as adults is to think a little bit differently about kind of how we think about dealing with some of the kids that we're seeing.
I was very excited about your report. I found it very comprehensive and really looking at the real issues and trying to define some neat solutions or some neat opportunities. And I think some of this work has been going on, but there clearly needs to be a lot more. And how do we leverage this work to really kind of be a catalyst for driving more change across more organizations at a higher pace. I really want to see where we're going to go with this so that we don't let this wonderful work that's been done not be fully leveraged to try to make a difference.
I think you have to own it. I think school boards have to own it. I think superintendents and central office have to own it. I think building principals have to own it. There was a discussion about suspensions as an example. I could speak to Minneapolis and St. Paul, but within each district there are the haves and have-nots. And anybody that would say that's not true would not be telling the truth. So as a principal of a building that was a have-not, and that was a preference of mine, you understand that your school is going to be the school that's going to have a revolving door, that you're going to get kids, many kids from the have-nots. And so if you know that, then you have to be intentional about that whole situation. You have to set up a situation where you know you're going to get a couple of new kids every week. And so you set up a process, a particular assistant principal, a particular counselor, a particular group of teachers, a special ed teacher. You agree that you're not going to accept, again, there's high mobility in our schools, and I can't tell you often how often incomplete IEPs come along with Johnny and Mary that are administratively transferred. And all you have to do as a building principal is to refuse to take that student. I'll take him or I'll take her, but the IEP must be complete. And all of a sudden, things change miraculously. People begin to be involved that weren't necessarily involved before. But again, you have to be intentional. You have to know what's before you and then deal with it accordingly. And again, as I said, school boards, area superintendents need to own it as well.
I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and I see pockets of success, but my concern is how do we get those pockets to be broad success? How do we get at a faster pace? Because, as you said, these kids have one chance at it. How can we leverage your work and others?
I see this report as an opportunity for decision makers in the county, whether it be at the county level, school board, and other elected officials and appointed officials, to actually come together and set some goals that we can do together as we do our work together with children and youth. That's one of the things that I've found some success with my superintendents in the 916 district, is we've worked on common projects together and supported each other through some of that work. I think that same kind of effort could happen across the county. And, one of the frustrating things for me in reading this report is, how many hundreds of great ideas there are in here. And you can get a little overwhelmed when you read it, and where do you start? But you have to start somewhere. You have to support what already is being advanced in our agencies and in our schools. But I'd love to see us pick 2 or 3 items out of this report and build upon that across all of our agencies, and as leaders, put some resources behind it, put some expectations, as Larry speaks about, behind it, and take courage to advance some of this necessary work that we've laid out.
And I think what Connie's talking about is really what needs to happen. I mean, around this type of issue, it has to be what I would describe as kind of like a collective impact, where you've got various governments, agencies all working together around trying to address some of these issues. And so if you think about it, many of the kids that would show up as somebody who we might have prosecuted in the delinquency system for an assault 4, I'd be willing to bet that there's probably a child protection issue going on. I'd be willing to bet that maybe that isn't necessarily the first time that they might have been in the juvenile delinquency system. And I bet you there's other things that potentially were going on, truancy, other factors. But imagine if there's a way in which people who have access to this data could all be working towards. So for instance, let's say a kid was on diversion, right, in the juvenile system, that they're all knowledgeable of some of the issues that are happening in the schools, and we're all working towards trying to achieve better outcomes for this child and family. We're sharing data, right? I think that would be a grand, grand vision, and that conversation is actually happening right now in the county, where we're trying to get school districts and the county and city talking about it. But at the same time, because of the divides that are in our community and maybe the lack of trust that people might have with respect to government having this information or a prosecution office, et cetera. And then there's data practices laws that are there for good reasons, that protect healthcare data, that protect the privacy of certain children's information. So it's really challenging. But I know that there's got to be a way to kind of bring people together. Today I had a great meeting with the Wilder Foundation, and I promoted and talked a little bit about some of this work. And so, and I certainly have a commitment, and I know that others in the county have expressed that, and I hope all of you, those of you who are elected officials, will also join me in kind of talking about this issue more and figuring out ways or solutions to bring to reality some of the things that are being talked about in this report. I don't know if that answers your question.
Hi, I wanted to follow up with something that came up earlier in the panel conversation, and it was about students falling through the crack, potentially falling through the cracks while teachers or administrators are gaining the skills that they need to be able to work with our students. I'm interested in the task force. Were there conversations about that? Were there any solutions or thoughts of ideas that came up? And or if not, interested on how the panel members feel about that.
Well, there was some conversation, I think, disagreement related to that. Oftentimes, the concept of finances comes into play. That we, to pay the training. There are experts within our schools. People, colleagues that are very successful working with kids, with different types of kids, and for whatever reason, the powers to be tend to go to different places to find experts to come in and tell them what to do and how to do it. When, again, within many of our school districts, there are experts and people who do it as well or better than other people in the country. The other part of it, again, is that there are people in the community, agencies, organizations that are working with our young people that could easily give schools ideas on how to handle the kids that they work with. It's like what we say, best practices in a school. Teacher that does really well does it the right way. Well, there are agencies in our community and people in our communities that work with our young people. But we tend to always want to be trained and have an expert come in and then it's a new idea every quarter. They bring in someone that's new, that has a new idea, that's sold a new book or whatever, and then everybody's supposed to fall in line and work with that kind of training. And that's where I say the kids fall to the wayside or aren't attended to as well as they should be, because everybody's trying to find themselves. And in many cases, quite frankly, faculties argue about, I'm not going to do it, it's more work. Here's another thing that they're going to put on me kind of attitude. Then you have principals or administrators who are being pressured to make sure your staff buys into it, because the district has invested a lot of money into the program. So you get that kind of almost politicizing.
Yeah, we talked about there is a lack of accountability when it comes to implementing different practices that may work. because people still have an opportunity to sort of opt out or use it as a compliance rather than as an opportunity to transform the climate in their buildings. And there are a lot of things that we can do in our buildings currently by building staff up and building the capacity in our staff. If we're talking about training, we also have to have coaching, and we have to have follow-up, we have to have systems of accountability. Otherwise, that becomes just another training that I can check off of my list. We have to be really intentional about our plan and how it will be implemented, and what is the data behind it? Where were we when we started this? How can we do data checks in the middle to make sure that we are actually progressing? And I think sometimes those systems are missing. We send a teacher to a training and then they're supposed to all of a sudden know how to do whatever it is they got trained on without having the coaching or the follow-up or the accountability. And just on a more positive note, just with restorative practices, and I have been working with schools on training and implementation and having weekly coaching, and we've seen a number of children and families experience change, and teachers really in how they view our children and how important it is, knowing now how important it is to build those relationships that you were talking about. We have reached out to, the thing about restorative practices is not just about the child, but it's also about the adults in the building. It's also about community members. All the things that you were talking about, it allows us to come together as a community to support children. And so there's a number of different ways that happens. It also gives students voice. A lot of times our students feel like they don't have a voice and they can't be a part of decision making for them. And so what restorative practices does is helps them to be critical thinkers about incidents that happen in school, proactive. There's a proactive piece to it where you build community around restorative practices circles before any incident even happens. Teachers are learning how to be circle keepers in their buildings and building community with their students and with their parents. We've done restorative practices circles in conferences. We've done restorative practices circles when harm needed to be repaired. So there's a lot of ways that we can connect students and teachers and community with that process. And it's not something added to teachers. It's not a curriculum that you take out of a box. It is a way of being. And so the things that they're already doing in their classrooms, it's just a way that they approach it with the restorative practices. We've seen fifth graders actually handle conflict that's been on the playground through using restorative practices and being a leader and leading and facilitating circle processes. So there's a number of ways that we can use that, and we all know that there's research out there that says that it works, and I think that we keep trying to come up with something new. There's research that says that it works. We need to grab a hold of that, invest in it, and stop changing things for teachers every couple of years. And that's part of the reason why you don't get buy-in, because it's like, oh, what's the new flavor of the year? And then teachers go, oh, now it's restorative practices. I'm not sure if I want to do that for the next 6 months because it'll be something else. So we need to make a decision about how we can find something that we want to invest into, do our research. It's already out there. California's doing a great job. They're ahead of us. It started here in Minnesota, so it's pretty kind of disheartening that other states have just taken a hold and they figure out how to connect with each other and how to support each other around it, and they have tremendous results. So we need to figure out what is it that we're going to invest in, do our research, and invest in it, and stay with it.
And those are the kinds of initiatives that really start to change the culture of a school building, the culture of an entire district. But it does take commitment to stay with it through leadership changes. School boards have to be willing to put resources behind it consistently for the training, for the coaching. It's not a sit and get kind of thing. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of reflection and but it does have a powerful impact on kids. There are other strategies that schools use as well. We use something called teacher-child interaction training in our programs, and it's a little different than restorative practices, but we also have seen a tremendous positive impact on students' choices for behaviors because teachers are interacting with the students differently, and students more engaged in their academic work, and that's starting to soar as well. So we need to research, find something that works in your school community, and then really support it over a long period of time so that you can have that positive impact on the culture, and we as adults being differently and interacting differently with kids.
I just wanted to comment, it seems like a lot of the discussion tonight is about kind of what schools can do and what school boards and teachers and superintendents can do, but it seems like some of the recommendations were a little broader and more about the community and maybe some social services and county, and I haven't read the report yet, and I'm going to spend some time doing that, but I'm interested if you could talk to that and speak to that. Is and should the focus be in our schools because that's where the interaction is, or do you really see this to be a broader focus on some of these recommendations?
Well, I certainly do. The experience in our district is we really survive in doing our job well because of partnerships with other agencies, with other organizations that are working to help young people have success. For example, the last year we've had a partnership with Hazelton. Hazelton as an organization is trying to develop a model that they can implement more broadly in schools to support young people who have chemical issues. I think that schools and the county can work stronger in partnership. We work in silos, and I think we recognize that. One of my frustrations regarding mental health is that by statute, counties have the responsibility for children's mental health, but they don't have to spend any money on it. And not to be critical of counties, because a lot of their resources have been reduced over time, but I think we can come to the table and partner much stronger than we have in the past. And I see this as an opportunity for us to do this in Ramsey County. So those just are a couple things that I would share.
And our intent was to focus around what community solutions are, because again, we've said when we went into this that these problems are manifesting in our schools, but they're really community problems. And so, but it's hard not to talk about things that happen within the four walls of the building,
Right.
So,
I just hope, as a task force, we're not, that this is only for school boards to own and buildings to own, because I see it as, frankly, as a school board member, I feel like there's a great responsibility for our counties to step up and provide the social service safety net and, help ensure when the kids come to school, they are ready to learn. Granted, schools have the opportunity to interact every single day, and we need to do better, but we also need to help families as they're struggling with those traumas and provide that safety net when kids are struggling, when families are struggling. So, thank you.
Parks and Recreation is a good example, would be a good example of a non-school, but connecting them to local schools and supporting the schools and with programming, melding their programming with the after-school programming. A lot could be done, particularly with after-school programming, and that in itself would be a revelation to a lot of our young people if they had a decent after-school program to go to. But for whatever reason, Parks and Rec and school systems just don't meld very well.
So we are coming close to the end of our time, but you mentioned something about a little bit broader beyond the assaults in school, but there was a slide that we didn't show. Talk about the time of day in which kids are getting in trouble. What time was that? Like right after school?
3 to 9. 3 to 6.
Yeah. coordinate city and libraries and county, resources and try to figure out ways to better intervene during that time. I think those are really positive things that we as a community can do. I know there's some people here from Roseville. There's a lot of thefts coming out of that Walmart, right? But I know that a lot of the time frame that happens is right after school. So, but I think this has been a really lively discussion. The task force report is available on our website, and we've brought some copies here if anybody would like a copy. If any of the school board members here want to have further discussions and wanted to engage, I'd really love to connect with any of you. I'd love to come and just visit with you, and I suppose I can't meet with. I suppose I come to a meeting, but I'm not necessarily asking to come to a meeting. But if you wanted to just have a meeting about what we could do in various parts of the community and how I could be a champion for some of these issues, please let me know, because I really don't want to leave this space, because whatever I can do as the county attorney to avoid having families and kids come to my attention is going to make our community so much better. So with that, I really want to thank all of you, and I thought the conversation that we were all engaged in was a really, really good one, and it's a good start. And I think the most important thing is that it doesn't end here, it just continues on, and we start committing to doing things. So thank you very much.